Welcome to a Tech Moment on Cannabis Tech. I'm your host, Christina Etter. In this show, we take just a few minutes to talk about some of the exciting science and technology that's happening in and around the cannabis and hemp industries and really driving the industry forward. Now, obviously, for the last several years, cannabis legalization has been moving forward at a breakneck pace. Yet, we still have issues. There's still problems with banking. Investors don't want to get involved. They're hesitant. Finding funding for a lot of these cannabis businesses is very challenging. And appealing to the investors that are interested in funding cannabis businesses can be a little difficult sometimes. With more than 35 years of executive-level experience, our guest today brings a wealth of knowledge to the cannabis space. So please welcome Geoff Trotter, who is the CGO and co-founder of Regennabis. Welcome to the show, Geoff.
Well, it's great to be here. Thank you very much.
Now, I love your background. When I was reading your bio, you have such an incredibly diverse, worldwide background. I would love for you to dive in a little bit on your career history and kind of what led to the creation of Regennabis.
Sure. Well, that's very kind of you to say that. As you could probably tell, I'm not from around here. I'm originally from the UK. I grew up in the northeast of England. My career... I went to college in Sheffield, which is another city in England. Upon graduation, I moved into the world of publishing, and specifically the world of online publishing. And at that time, we were moving from hard copy, and I'm going to age myself significantly here, but working in the world of microfilm and microfiche and magnetic tape. So this was pre-internet. I mean, that gives you a sense of when this was all going on. And I developed my career in that space. At that time, I was also traveling quite extensively for the role, mainly to initially Europe and then into Asia, into Latin America. And of course, that just sort of filled my mind with all sorts of wonderful opportunity around not only working in those places, but living in those places. So, park that for a moment. But as I was working in the publishing space, and also at the cutting edge of a new world opening up around publishing in the sense of online publishing, that was where I sort of cut my teeth, if you like, from a career perspective. I then went back to college for a little bit, and I studied marketing around, again, international marketing. That led me to move out of the publishing world and into the financial services world. I was kind of fascinated with what was happening in the world of finance, but more importantly, data and information that enabled, swifter and better decisions to be made. I did that for a short while, and then that coincided with what, in essence, was the first collapse at a financial level in what was called the Asian financial crisis, 1997-98, which was really a precursor to what happened 10 years later in 2008, 2009, and to some degree we're still recovering from that. I retrenched somewhat. I kind of took a slight deviation, but somewhat back into the world of publishing. I worked with a group called Guinness World Records. I'm sure everybody's heard of Guinness World Records. I was general manager there. So still in publishing, information, but now into the realms and other sort of cutting edge space around knowledge management. And I mean, ultimately, if you think about it, the Guinness Book of World Records is the ultimate book of knowledge. But I was missing the sort of the kick that you would get from being in the finance world and the business world. And after about 3 or 4 years there, I got a call from a recruiter who was hiring into Ernst & Young, one of the big four advisory businesses. I seized the opportunity not only to work with them and sort of in the sort of cutting edge of the corporate world and finance, but specifically to get me back to Asia, because they were really looking to develop a role within their business out of Asia. So I took a role in Hong Kong, and so that for me was a sweet spot in Asia, in the knowledge world really helped driving the frontier of business. But there was a bit missing. I did that for a while, and I realized that I was making some exceptionally wealthy people even wealthier. And whilst that was good for them, I really was going back to my own roots from the northeast of England. And I decided that I really needed to get off that gravy train for my own sanity more than anything else. I was very interested in what was developing in the world around sustainability. Again, I took the opportunity to sort of jump in early into what I felt was going to be a key space, and that's proven to be the case. I also then stepped away from Asia. I moved to California. I undertook some study at the Presidio Graduate School here in San Francisco, and that really helped me get grounded a little bit more around sustainability. And after graduating, I moved into the nonprofit world because I really wanted to get a sense of a more rounded idea of working in corporations, working in, to some degree in the government space. So I joined a group called Global Footprint Network that really helped me understand the limits to growth, because the work they were doing was looking at the putting the ecological limits central to economic policy making. I stepped away from there after about 3 years, moved to Sustainable Brands, which, as its name might suggest, is working with some of the biggest branded corporations in the world, but really helping them with their sustainability narrative. And that's where I met Patrick. Patrick is the co-founder. Patrick McCartan is the co-founder at Regennabis. And he and I worked together for a good 5 years. And subsequently, after we both left the organization, we would stay in regular touch. He had been around the world exploring the world of cannabis, whilst I was jumping back into the world of advisory, largely working with different UN agencies. And as we would convene once a month or so in San Francisco, we began to hatch the plot that to sort of dominate the world, if you like. And we decided to create Regennabis. And the purpose of Regennabis really is to democratize the opportunity for regenerative growth for all, not only in the cannabis industry, but beyond the cannabis industry. And so with our focus around advisory work, our focus around cannabis, but also our focus about convening and bringing folks together, as well as investment, that formed the sort of the nucleus of the services that we create and deliver at Regennabis. So that's the sort of the background to that.
Fabulous. You obviously have a wealth of experience that you're bringing into this industry, and I think that's so vital considering, I feel like the cannabis industry is really good at the cannabis, but in speaking to a lot of the people that I speak with on my podcast, there's some of more of that business side of things in the cannabis industry that sometimes have a tendency to get overlooked. So it's exciting for me to see people like yourself coming into the industry and bringing this kind of knowledge and experience and sharing that. But before we dive in specifically with the cannabis space, let's talk about Regennabis from a more general stance. Now, your website says that Regennabis is centered on building regenerative industries. So can you kind of define what you mean by a regenerative industry?
Sure, yeah, that's a great place to start, because I think it level sets. It helps an audience just understand a little bit more about the work that we're undertaking. We come from the world of sustainability, and sustainability, I'm afraid, is just not going to be enough to help not just the planet, but society. And frankly, it's not going to be enough for businesses to only be sustainable or sustainability centric. You could argue that sustainability really just takes us back to business as usual and doing no further harm. From our perspective, we need a seismic shift. We need to think about regeneration, which really means no longer having extractive industries. And extractive doesn't only mean taking things out of the ground, but it also means extractive in the way we have relationships, whether it's with our employees, whether it's with our shareholders, our other stakeholders. And these industries generally have shown in their extractive and somewhat depleting way that the world is not necessarily a good place right now, and we need to see some transformative shift. And so our position is that if we can help the cannabis industry, and just to put a marker on this, the cannabis industry from our perspective at Regennabis is way more than the adult use recreational space, which is where most people focus and most attention is. But it's also another sector, health and wellness and medical space. And there's a third sector that we put into the broader cannabis industry definition, and that is in the industrial hemp space. And if we look at those three subsectors together, that forms the cannabis industry. And we feel that if we can help the cannabis industry grow up to be an even better player than it currently is, and we'll come back to that in a moment, but it's where the sort of the real premise of ESG work lies. But if we can help the industry grow up to be the best version of itself, then we could see how the plant, cannabis in its format, whether it's cannabis or hemp, has an incredible once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to perhaps deliver to some of the biggest challenges facing humanity. And that's why a lot of the work, in fact, all of the work that we undertake at Regennabis is underpinned by the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And so we see that if we get this right, and we can steer that, then not only will the cannabis industry become a regenerative industry, but through hemp, we see that pretty much any industry that begins with the letter F is going to be positively disrupted through hemp. And therefore, we could see regenerative farming, regenerative food, regenerative fashion, fabrics, including regenerative finance. And that is, as I say, part of the bigger notion behind why Regennabis exists. So I hope that kind of helps the idea of regenerative industries.
Absolutely. And I just have to say, for the cannabis space, for the hemp space, I know that this is something that is kind of on the tips of the tongues of everyone in this industry. Sustainability is such a big word, and we know that the cannabis space right now is using way more of a carbon footprint than they should be. We know that the energy requirements for cannabis growth in medical or recreational areas is astronomical right now, and I know that there's a big push to help businesses become more sustainable. But from your perspective, why is this so very critical for cannabis and hemp to embrace this now?
From our perspective, the version of the cannabis industry that's already out the gate, so to speak, is a little overly focused on the economic side. It's some people call it the green rush. And we believe that nothing wrong with capitalism, so to speak, nothing wrong with a focus on economics. It is, after all, what makes the world go around. But I think from our perspective, we like to take a multi-capital view, that there are other forms of capital that we need to be cognizant of and we need to be delivering to. That's human capital, social capital, intellectual capital, and ultimately natural capital. Because no matter where you are in any kind of business or any kind of geography, we're fundamentally all in the same boat here. And that is, if we don't take care of this planet, then we're going to struggle. No matter how wealthy you are or how well positioned you might well be geographically, we're all going to struggle and suffer. And so we need to think of that in that sense. And we feel that if there is a better version of the cannabis industry, now is the time to course correct. And part of that is being driven not just by what we're saying at Regennabis. It's great to be sort of, the advanced search party, if you like. But, ultimately, we're now seeing this coming from regulators. We're for sure going to see it coming from investors. But we're also seeing it from other corporations that are operating outside of the cannabis industry, but are kind of curious, to use a term. They're interested increasingly in what is happening in the cannabis industry. And we only have to look to a few days ago with a $7.6 billion acquisition from Pfizer of a cannabis business. It's not the first, it's not the last. There will be many like that. So those corporations are clearly looking at well-behaved organizations that they're going to be acquiring. And I use the term well-behaved, and we can again dive into that. But the investors are increasingly going to be asking for this and demanding it of cannabis businesses, because we can already see in the Fortune 500 world, ESG has a big role to play, and 93% of Fortune 500 companies have an ESG report. Less than 1% of cannabis publicly listed companies have an ESG report. But institutional investors are going to be seeking this. And as soon as either the Safe Banking Act is passed or federal legalization happens here in the United States, those institutional investors, not all, but some, on a standard deviation curve, it's still going to be a significant number of institutional investors, will be seeking that sort of grown-up version, those better behaviors that they wish to invest in, because frankly it's their fiduciary duty. And then at a government level, you could see over the next couple of years that Gary Gensler, who's heading the SEC under the Biden administration, is increasingly going to be placing mandatory demands that upon any publicly listed company, not just those in the cannabis space, but you could imagine in the next 2 years that every publicly listed entity in the United States will have to disclose its ESG position in its 10K filings. So it's a perfect storm. Not just Regennabis, but the government, investors, and other corporations. So it's now. This really needs to happen.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Now, before we, dive into some different things, one of the things that you mentioned, only 1% of cannabis businesses have this ESG report. Do you want to dive in and explain what ESG really is and why that is so important for cannabis businesses to get their heads wrapped around this concept?
Sure. Yes, I can do that. So ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. If you like, those are the three components of what those in the sustainability world, will refer to as the triple bottom line approach. Environment, society, as in people. So you have the planet, you have people, and then you have profit, if you like, the governance/economic aspect. So these three combined under this framework is really fundamentally there to help enhance performance. And in that sense, whether it's from the investor side or the corporate side, they fundamentally will deliver performance objectives, and therefore an opportunity for someone to view the good performance, if not great performance, of companies who are aligned to delivering an ESG framework. So let me just put that a little bit more into perspective. Fundamentally also around ESG, what we're looking at is materiality. And that's a financial term, and it's well worth help folks to understand more about what that really means. But in essence, it means that there is a broad group of things that a company should be aware of and taking notice of and measuring. These things are called material, and they're defined. They have been defined over a good period of time now through organizations like the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board, SASB, and you could, your viewers and listeners can see this at sasb.org. But they have defined over a period of time what are the material issues in a certain sector, a vertical sector, that are environmentally, social, as well as from a governance perspective, the things that you really must be taking care of because they are material to your business. If you stop doing them, then bad things would happen on a financial level. And so from our perspective, what we're looking at doing is helping folks understand that if you are paying attention to these things that are material and you're delivering over a period of time and responding to the changes that are happening either internal to your organization or forced upon you because external to the organization, fast, rapid growth, new legalization, etc., or even demands placed upon you by the government in terms of your energy use and your resource use from perspective of say a carbon footprint, then by taking note of this and speaking to them on a frequent basis, then your stakeholders, being your employees, your clients if you're a business to business play, your consumers if you're a business to consumer play, the regulators as well as the investors have a much better view from a transparency perspective of how you're performing. And the better you're performing, the greater the opportunity that investors will continue or wish to invest in you, that the regulators will leave you alone. You don't want the regulators knocking on your door. And you're going to also, certainly in the cannabis space, which is a growth industry, you're going to attract the right level of talent, and you're going to be able to retain the right level of talent because of your ESG position and focus. And consumers are increasingly savvy. It's not difficult these days to really get under the hood, for want of a term, of a company and in the publicly listed space to determine how well they're performing. But consumers are increasingly asking and seeking that level of transparency upon which trust can be built. And this is why I think, if you take all of these different aspects, then this is what a very solid position on an ESG, your corporate ESG position can deliver to. Then you're going to be mitigating risks for your business. So fundamentally, that's what we reference as ESG.
Fantastic. Now, you went into, why the ESG is valuable for businesses. Tell me a little bit about what actually goes into developing that ESG strategy. And then also, I would love for you to touch base on what Regennabis offers, because I think you have like an accelerator program or something to help businesses move into a solid ESG strategy. So do you want to talk about those two things?
Sure, yeah. And they're linked, obviously. From our perspective, in order to, and let's be quite clear here, an ESG report or a sustainability report or a CSR report, whatever you want to call it, is not the end game. It's all of these, it's just part of a journey. But in order to document your journey and to give all external parties, stakeholders in your business, a perspective on what your intentions are and that you're going to deliver to, then you need to have an ESG report, we believe, in the very first instance. And in order to have an ESG report, you really need to understand what's material for your business. And so at Regennabis, what we do when we start talking an initial conversation with our clients is to help them understand what is their materiality position. What are the environmental aspects, the social aspects, as well as the governance aspects that they really must be paying attention to? And then how do we set about capturing them on a day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month basis in a seamless way so that you have this data available to you, and from that you can create your annual report as well as your quarterly updates. The idea is that we're better positioning the CEO or the C-suite of these companies so that when they're asked questions in the quarterly IR calls, whether that call is coming from someone at Cowen, from Needham, or whomever it is, they're increasingly being asked questions about their ESG position. And so what we're looking to do is to help them understand what is their current state, but also to help them think through what that future state vision could be and how they can answer to those questions over a period of time. And so the Regennabis ESG Accelerator is our programmatic approach to help do that. Create, through a series of discussions and a materiality assessment, what is the current state. Speak with the board as well as the executive team of the organization to determine what is their future state vision, what it is that they'd like to deliver to, and then how do we close that gap over a period of time. But we also are helping them, as I said earlier, this is a fast-moving industry. There are acquisitions happening all the time, coming in from non-cannabis markets and sectors. And so one of the other things that we're really doing is helping clients stay ahead of that, because there might be a materiality shift in their business if all of a sudden they have more cultivation sites than they did 3 months ago and less retail space on an index basis. And so therefore their materiality will have shifted from being a retail-led, material-driven business to a cultivated-led one. And so that's something that we also help with. The dynamism that is the ESG space. It's not fixed. It's a forever removable feast. So we help them with that. And our typical approach depends on the complexity of the organization, but it can take anything from 8 to 13 weeks. So, 2 months to 3 months to help get an organization to that point. And then we work with them on an ongoing basis, sometimes on a retainer basis, to help them just answer some of the questions that are typically going to be fired at them from the IR community. So that's what we do with the ESG Accelerator.
I think it's fantastic. The way that Regennabis is really helping kind of guide cannabis industries into this more modern space, I guess I want to say, or a more accepted business practices. Because, like I said early on, in the cannabis space, I feel like there's a lot of businesses that are good at what they do, but they might not necessarily grasp that more traditional business model that's obviously going to come into play as cannabis continues to be legalized. And so I think businesses like yours are super critical for those businesses or those entities that really are wanting to see this move forward in the future and work with investors and do all the things that you're doing. And as you stated, I mean, ESG is super important for the investors to really be able to see the inner workings of the business and longevity, I think. Is that what most of the investors are using this kind of information for when they're looking at these different companies or looking at ESG reports?
Yeah, that's a great question. Just to say, is that what investors are looking for? Largely depends on the type of investor. From our perspective, the smart-moneyed folks, the ones that are really thinking of this from a longer-term perspective, then yes, for sure. They are looking at the environmental, social governance performance of those organizations that they're going to be investing their money in. And in the nascent cannabis industry, given, of course, that the sort of fluidity in the investment space is not necessarily from the institutional investor world, which typically is where the liquidity is in other industries. The liquidity in the early days in the cannabis industry is coming from private investors, and perhaps some of those are not ESG led, but we would argue that they should be, especially if they want to have a better handle on the long-term opportunity for the business that they're going to be investing in. If that business has a good handle on its environmental, social governance factors and knows what it's looking at, then from our perspective, we are seeing that strategically, financially, and operationally, these organizations are delivering excellence. And that would be a safer bet. It's not going to be the safe bet. There's no such thing as a risk-free investment, but it's going to mitigate that risk somewhat. But there's another massive group of investors, family offices, that are increasingly showing an appetite for the cannabis world. And increasingly, these family offices, typically second, third, fourth generation wealth. I mean, in order to be deemed a family office, you have to have at least $50 million, but many have way more than that. And so these family offices, and if you think of a group, for example, like Nexus Global is one of many groups that convene family offices. But within Nexus Global, most of those family offices are really thinking more about their own legacy. They're not only interested in the economic impact that their money can deliver. They're very interested in the social impact as well as the environmental impact. This is the perfect storm for family offices, because increasingly cannabis companies can show and demonstrate that through their ESG performance, which also means then that family offices are going to be very excited and interested in those companies. And so that's part of what we're undertaking at Regennabis. We're finding the opportunity for family offices to identify those cannabis companies that are behaving perhaps better than most by demonstrating their ESG smarts, which means that the access to capital for those cannabis companies has increased greatly. So that's another sort of piece to this sort of systemic puzzle, if you like. Where there are many nuances to all of this, but that's another piece, especially ahead of full federal legalization here in the United States.
That's actually a phenomenal segue into my next line of questioning, because I wanted to talk a little bit about Regennabis Ventures. So you have another arm of the company that, besides just helping businesses build some of these better practices and things like that, you actually work with them to help them find this funding as well. Do you want to talk a little bit about the capital management side of Regennabis?
Yeah, sure. So we have it's a separate entity, as you pointed out, and rightly so, it's a separate entity. It's called Regennabis Ventures. And so it completes the trinity of services, if you like, the verticals that we have under the Regennabis sort of group. We advise, we've already referenced, and we convene through our Regennabis member network and a series of events that we're going to be undertaking with the UN. Aside from those two verticals, we're also an investment arm. We're in the process right now of raising capital for our first fund that sits under Regennabis Ventures, which is an LP that falls under the general partner of Symmetry Capital. So myself and Patrick, along with Kelly Seringer, who is the third portfolio manager, if you like, in Regennabis Ventures. Kelly has a 20-plus year experience of running a hedge fund called Symmetry Capital that has really been active in the healthcare and biotech space. So has a very keen eye on the medical health and wellness space. And a few years ago, looked to launch a public equity fund called Medicus. But that fund, just like Regennabis Ventures, although Regennabis is a private equity fund, so looking at private companies rather than public company investment, both of these funds are what we call ESG screened. So we use an ESG screen when we're looking at potential portfolio companies that we're going to be investing our monies in. And so it's one thing to say that we're advocating for ESG in those companies. What we're also doing is we're using this ESG screen. How are they behaving from an environmental perspective, a social perspective, and governance perspective, that then tell us that this would be a place where we would want to invest our monies. I mean, ultimately, we're an impact investment fund, which means that we are also seeking not only an economic return, but we want to see some social impact output as well as an environmental impact. And that again, we sort of talk about this multi-capital play. In fact, we sometimes refer to ourselves as a venture multi-capital firm rather than just a venture capital firm, because venture capital firms, they'll take care of themselves always first. They'll take care of themselves, just the economics. You just have to look at some of the big players in the venture capital space. We're very different in the sense that we position ourselves as a venture multi-capital because we place multiple capitals into the business, and we are expecting multiple capital responses out of the business. And one of the ways in which we do that is that with the portfolio companies that we're already looking at, and when the funds are raised, we know exactly where we will be investing. Those companies already are demonstrating either an appetite or an aptitude for environmental social governance. But the other thing that we're doing is the ESG accelerator that I referenced earlier, that we provide as a service for a fee, in our portfolio companies, we drop that ESG accelerator into their ongoing frameworks with no charge. I mean, there's no double dipping, as the SEC would be very interested in. We basically take the ESG accelerator and we embed that into the portfolio companies, so they grow up almost first nature, with ESG baked into the way that they do things. And we believe that that's a great way to help them. I mean, we're early stage investors, but at some point, those cannabis companies that we've invested in will look for a Series A or Series B or, beyond. And for sure, when they get to Series A and Series B, when they're looking for those raises, the investors will be looking at ESG as it being in evidence in those companies. So what we're really helping these growing companies with is being better prepared for the eventuality that they will be seeking further funding, and the cost of capital for them on that occasion will drop significantly because the investor will be beyond delighted to see that there is an ESG play in place. So there's a little bit of sort of method in the madness, if you like, but that's kind of how we do it in a sort of cyclical way.
Now, one of the things I wonder is, at this point in the United States, there's still issues in accessing traditional banking. There's still issues with accessing different financial solutions in the cannabis space because of the current legal status that it's in. And I also think because of the stigmas that were involved with the cannabis space prior to legalization, most cannabis businesses have had to work outside of all of this traditional, business transaction. Why is it so important? If you were talking to a cannabis entrepreneur right now, why is it so important to get ahead of this curve and kind of prepare for this now versus waiting for legislation to change or the market to become more favorable? Why is it so important now?
Yeah, I'd say it's important now for many of the reasons that I mentioned earlier, in terms of it's not just Regennabis saying to these companies, this would be a good idea for you guys. The regulators, I've already mentioned the SEC, investors, as soon as either the Safe Banking Act passes, and I know it's just hit another hurdle, but at some point it will pass, or there will be full federal legalization in the United States. It will happen at some point in the next 2 to 3 years. I don't know when, but there is an inevitability about it. So this is coming. And you can also see that in some of the acquirers or investors from a corporate perspective in the cannabis industry, whether it's big tobacco, big alcohol, or big pharma, as we've just seen recently, or it's coming from the consumer goods companies who are beginning to seek acquisitions in the cannabis space. All of these companies, as acquirers, are beginning to look at ESG as a way in which they can predetermine whether or not there is less risk in the target company that they're looking at. So this is coming. If you wait too long, then you're in catch-up mode. And when you're in catch-up mode, you're rushing and frankly, there is insufficient evidence that there's really been an appetite for this in the first instance. It just makes, from our perspective, solid business sense that you should be doing this now, and you should be really getting well down the road to developing your ESG smarts, so to speak. So this is going to come. And as I've said already, with 93% of Fortune 500 companies have an ESG report, because institutional investors, it's their fiduciary duty to return maximized shareholder returns. But shareholders also now increasingly include other stakeholders because of positions around climate change, around diversity, equity, and inclusion, around other aspects of social impact. And in the cannabis space, social equity is one of the big spaces. So our perspective is, do it now, save yourself an awful lot of trouble. And frankly, we're already seeing that those companies in the cannabis space that were early adopters, Rubicon Organics were the first listed cannabis company to come out with an ESG report, which is we think is a really a solid example of what an ESG report could be. Chiron Life Sciences were the second, and then just 2 or 3 weeks ago, Trulieve were the third in the public domain to release really what is an ESG report. And as the case with any first through the wall, you're going to get a little bit bloodied, you're going to get a little bit, but let's applaud these organizations for at least being front-footed enough to realize that this is the better set of behaviors that they really need to be putting forward. We can criticize the content of these reports as much as we wish, but frankly what we ought to be doing is commending them for at least making that effort, and it will only get better. This is the start of a journey for them. We would encourage any publicly listed cannabis company to get a move on with this sooner rather than later, because before too long it's going to be upon them, and by that time, as I said, they're just in catch-up mode, and that's not necessarily a good place to be.
Most definitely. So cannabis entrepreneurs, if you're out there, be sure that you're checking into those ESG reports and working on getting those taken care of, because obviously that's going to be super important in the future. That's solid advice, I think, for anyone in the cannabis space. Now I want to shift gears a little bit now and talk about the event, because Regennabis is hosting Regenerative Cannabis Live, which is going to be held in New York City at the UN Delegates Dining Room. So do you want to talk about this event, and what are your overall goals and mission?
Right. Let me tell you then that it's not a single event. It's a series of events. We intend that we will host 2 of these per year, right through to the end of 2030, which is the end of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which started in 2015-16. They run through to 2030. And by the time we get to the end of 2030, we hope to have collectively solved these 17 Sustainable Development Goals, 169 targets, 244 indicators. That's the goal, the goal of the goals, if you like. From our perspective, we see that there's a great opportunity, as I referenced earlier, if we can harness the opportunity around the plant to develop an industry of subsectors that can deliver to these goals. From our perspective, we see that if we approach the conversations and the actions that are being undertaken by certain corporations and increasing number of governments, then we can see that cannabis in all of its sectors can deliver economic impact, social impact, as well as environmental impact. And so the idea behind Regenerative Cannabis Live is to really demonstrate the art of the possible, to get people in the room, the ecosystem in the room of governments, whether national or regional, the ecosystem of investors, family offices, and some of the early adopters around institutional investors. We also want to pull cannabis companies in the room, those that I've just mentioned that are a little front-footed, leading, if you like. We also will have some corporations in the room from Fortune 500 companies, and we'll have civil society in the room, so folks that are representative of some of the minority groups that are being continually disenfranchised, and we need to harness their position to really cajole the cannabis businesses to embrace. And we can already see some companies in the cannabis space are really doing some wonderful work with some of these civil society organizations. Last Prisoner Project is one, minority owners and cannabis business is another. And we need to, so we're going to bring the ecosystem into the room twice a year, but it's not just about the event, it's what happens before, during, and then after, and rinse and repeat as we move these conversations along. And so the event on February the 17th, which will take place in the UN in the Delegates Dining Room, is a whole day where we'll look at, on that occasion, 6 different panel discussions, 2 around economic impact, 2 around social impact, and 2 around environmental impact. For example, one of the panels where we'll kick off the day by looking at what happens when we normalize, regulate, and legalize cannabis. Prior to that panel kicking off, we're 99% certain that we will have a senior representative of the Uruguayan government. And Uruguay is one of only 2 countries currently that have fully legalized cannabis. So that will help sort of frame the discussion for the rest of the day, and then we get into a little bit more around what happens when we regulate and legalize the industry. But the second panel is a cautionary note from our perspective, because it says it's all well and good that we might get to a point of regulating and legalizing the industry, but we really need to think long and hard about regenerating society before we rush ahead with a fully legalized cannabis industry. And by that, we need to really address the elephant in the room, which fundamentally has been driven the last 50 years around the war on drugs and has done untold harm to disenfranchised populations, typically black, brown folk, as well as indigenous populations. And so we need to really think long and hard about a regenerative society that cannabis industry could deliver to and then can enhance other societies. We must look at restorative justice. We must look not only at diversity, equity, and inclusion in the industry, but in every industry. And we should also look at equitable business models, because if we want to regenerate society, we can't continue to just deliver to the 1% and ensure then that the chasm between those who have and those who have not, and the Gini coefficients of rich nations just keeps getting bigger and bigger. We need to address this. So we need to address the difference between the global south and the global north. And this sounds all real sort of far-reaching but fundamentally, you look around you, whether it's the pandemic, whether it's wealth gap, whether it's race challenges that we're having, not just in the United States, but around the world, and we're seeing massive migratory challenges. It's time for us to really think long and hard about transforming ourselves through transformative industries and therefore regenerative industries. And that's why we feel if we can get people in the room, we're restricted to 220 persons in the room because of the size of the room, but we're going to live stream this event in both English and Spanish. We really need people to see that there is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for us to really harness positively this plant. And sometimes we say, for the plant, by the plant, of the plant, and we could say for the planet too. But I think that we do have this unique opportunity if we get this right, and at Regennabis we're determined to help people get this right. We kind of position ourselves as Sherpas, for want of a term. We bring people in the room, they do all their magic, we step away and we rinse and repeat, and we'll do the same later on in 2022 when we go back to New York for event 2, and then we'll take it around the world. And the idea is that increasingly we'll have more and more governments. The German government are now seemingly moving into this world. We'll have representation from Mexico, who will probably be one of the next nations to go full federal legalization. So that's the premise behind it, and we feel that we're well positioned to help this happen. And we just need to, I guess, cajole humanity that this is something we really need to do. So that's why we do what we do.
I think it sounds phenomenal. I have long felt like the wealth gap that we have, especially I think here in the United States, is it's time to do something different. And I think by opening up some of these doors and allowing, kind of leveling that playing field, I think for entrepreneurs and business owners. And I just think, in the long run, this is the direction that we have to go. If you look at all of the things that are going on in the world, just like you said, with social injustice and the pandemic and all of these things that are happening, I think there's a lot of us that recognize the fact that things need to change. And by bringing the awareness to them with events like this, I think that we're only moving, in that positive direction.
Sure. Well, thank you. I mean, just to sort of add to that too, when we talk about equalizing and leveling, let's be very clear here. We're not talking about those that are already wealthy having their wealth reduced. In fact, we can clearly see that those organizations that embrace sustainability in the broadest sense through their products and their corporate positioning, they outperform those that don't. The Dow Jones Sustainability Index is already there, the FTSE for Good Index, you name it. The evidence is already there. The business case for sustainability and regeneration is closed. We have to but what we can see clearly is that if we approach this in a multi-capital way, the rich will still get richer, but then so will everybody else. What we're doing is closing that gap, not by closing from the top and bringing it from the bottom, but we're moving them up so that they all grow together. And that's why we sort of reference multi-capitalism. We are capitalists at the end of the day. Patrick and I at Regennabis and the team, we're very focused on being we're a for-profit organization. We're not a non-profit, we're a for-profit organization. So we're capitalists, we get that. But at the same time, there's nothing stopping us from delivering a business that is also delivering a social upside as well as an environmental upside. And those are the behaviors that we think that others should do. And as I said, the business case is already there. It's already working. And so we're just breaking down some of those mindsets that are hanging around also from the Prohibition era, whether it's around drugs or otherwise. For the last 50 or 60 years, you can see that various economies have done well for the 1%. Many people say the system has failed. It hasn't failed. It's worked perfectly well for the folks who designed it. We just need to redesign it so that it works for many others. It works very well. If we can just extend it so that it works for all, that's the goal. And that's what we're setting out to achieve at Regennabis.
Now, you mentioned, and the press release on the event also mentioned, that there's limitations to the in-person event just because of the size of the room that you're going to be in. But you are hosting this virtually. So do you want to tell people how they can sign up or how they can get involved in this event or, listen in online, whatever they decide to do?
Yeah, sure. Over the next week and a half to 2 weeks, or probably just the other side of the holiday season, we will be going full guerrilla style marketing on all aspects of Regenerative Cannabis Live. But if you can, if I could ask viewers and listeners to remember regenerativeCannabisLive.com, that's the website to go to then see as the program is built out of speakers, etc. It's also where you will begin to identify where you can sign up to register for the event, for the live stream version of the event. So that's regenerativeCannabisLive.com. Regennabis.com is our website, which gives you a lot more information also about our advisory services, our convening, as well as the investment arm. So those are the two sites. My name, Geoff Trotter at Regennabis.com is where you will find me. And I would encourage everybody and anybody to reach out to me to learn a little bit more or a lot more about what we're doing at Regennabis. So those are the three ways in which you can find out about the event, the work that we're doing, and to touch base with me.
Well, thank you for that. And just so our listeners know, we're going to have all those links, everything that you need to get connected to Regennabis and the Regenerative Cannabis live event. We will have those below in the description of our podcast today as well. Now, before we kind of sign off, though, I wanted to touch base on one thing. I saw that Regennabis had a tweet recently in regards to the Safe Banking Act being kind of sidelined here recently. And you talk about making the case and really, how to make that case for cannabis and hemp and economic growth and how to really drive that home to our leaders and to the people that are really making these decisions. How do we do that? How do we get them to, really start to pay attention to all of these benefits that we're seeing come from the cannabis and hemp industries? Because but like you said, beyond economic growth, there's a ton of benefits that we're seeing come from this, especially in the United States. I think the hemp industry in particular has a wealth of potential in terms of, being able to create jobs and create all of these new things in the United States, even rejuvenate American manufacturing, so to speak. So I would love to hear from your perspective. What really do we need to do to drive home those factors?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I remember, Patrick and I and the team were considering, do we pull out the pin and throw the hand grenade around on that tweet around the Safe Banking Act, and we thought yes, because again, we call ourselves courageous optimists. Courageous in the sense that we leave no stone unturned, we leave no conversation. We go for it, and the Safe Banking Act is but one of the challenges facing the cannabis industry here in the United States. I mean, let's be clear also. It is the single biggest market today, but it may not always be the single biggest cannabis market, because as soon as Mexico goes federal, and the Supreme Court in Mexico seem to have the right idea, they're moving in that direction. Once that happens, the southern borders here will be, and just over the border, will be home to the biggest single cannabis market out there. Germany and Europe have already given a very clear indication that this is the path they're going to undertake. And Germany is the single biggest market within the European Union of 26, 27 countries. It depends if you still include the United Kingdom in that, which some do, some don't. Long and short of it is that economics fundamentally will drive this, and that's why we embrace the fact that we need to think like capitalists, but broaden the thinking to multi-capitals. But if we just look at the economics alone, frankly, at some point we believe that the United States will wake up and see that there is an enormous opportunity, even if they were to open up federally and then look at a greatly enhanced tax provision, because the one that's currently in place is just not fit for purpose. It's fit for purpose for those that are collecting the taxes, but not for businesses that have to endure. And so we really need to think about, if you broaden this opportunity in this, and you also look at the opportunities around a more fairer tax process, there's still enough money for the federal government as well as the states to grow and to develop. So it will all come down to economics. It's just a question. I mean, the United States just seems to fall over itself frequently. I mean, again, I can say that I'm not from here. I'm working within the confines of the United States, but it beggars belief, frankly, that this has become, just a continued debate, and the fact that the Safe Banking Act has been sidelined once again, it just is bizarre. But at some point, what will happen is other economies will begin to catch up, if not take over. and get ahead of the US economy as it relates to the cannabis industry. And I think that's generally when there'll be a sort of focusing of the minds, and then I think that's when federal legalization will happen. But it's painful to be a part of this when you can clearly see that there are benefits all around, not just economic benefits, but again, social impact as well as environmental impact. Hemp alone has an extraordinary capability. If we get that right and build out a robust supply chain around hemp, then, as I said earlier, it will impact other industries in a positive sense. But at the same time, those industries will entrench to some degree. The pharmaceutical industry isn't just going to roll over. Neither is the let's call it the big agricultural complex. But at some point, they will realize that if you strip away subsidies that are typically coming from government anyway, if you really look at the true cost of these industries, at some point, folks are going to realize that you're just going to have to go all in, full federal legalization on cannabis and hemp, and I think it will happen. Don't ask me when. I'm not. If I could predict stuff like that, I wouldn't necessarily be in this business. But there's an inevitability about it, and so I think it's driven by economics fundamentally.
I 100% agree with you. And I think that's, there's been a couple of headlines and a couple of different things that I've read this year that indicated that the social justice side of things may drive cannabis further forward than we had suspected. But I think ultimately it boils down to economics. It boils down to be able, to show that side of the industry and the value that comes from it. So I completely agree. And, I love having people like you on the show, because we do get an opportunity to talk about things from, a different perspective and looking at business in the future and looking at where cannabis is going, and having your insight is just so very valuable. And obviously we need to tell cannabis businesses again, get out there, get your ESG done, because this is what the investors are going to be looking for, So we'll put your contact information up here, Geoff, and make sure that people know that they can reach out to Regennabis for that kind of help and support. And we thank you so much for the work that you're doing, for coming on the show today and talking about all of these things. And we're definitely looking forward to that event in New York.
Yeah, we'll make sure you're in the room with us. I'm very much, looking forward to that. Many other things that we're doing, we're super stoked about it all. But in the interim, it's wonderful to be able to have the opportunity to get on a show like your own and to sort of talk about these broader, more systemic issues, and less about the stuff that most people talk about when we need more of these conversations. And I'm happily, I'd love to be part of these on an ongoing basis, maybe a regular contributor once every 6 months or so, just to tune in and see how things are going. But huge thank you to you for doing this.
Absolutely. And thank you again for coming on the show today. And like I said, to all our listeners out there, make sure you go out there and register for that event. I think you're going to learn a lot from it.